They say the loudest thing you can do in a crowded room is be utterly still. I proved them wrong that I told Marcus I was leaving while 50 strangers held their forks halfway to their mouths and a champagne flute hung like a question at his lips. The sound in that restaurant turned into a photograph. Frozen faces, silverware caught mid-clink, the stained glass light painting halos around heads. For a moment I let the tableau sit, because I wanted them to remember the moment I stopped being invisible. My name is Elena Hart. I'm 54, and up until that sentence left my mouth I'd been excellent at vanishing into the background, the wife who kept the scaffolding of our life sturdy while my husband chased fireworks. Marcus liked reinvention. New businesses, new identities, new promises. I kept the receipts, filed the taxes, saved the college money, edited the resume after the passion project fizzled. Our daughter, Lily, was supposed to be the bright seam that stitched the whole mess together, a seam I'd pulled taut with refusing hands until the day she walked across that stage, when Marcus stood and announced a new beginning, not mine, his. The room expected drama. Tears, an argument, maybe a chair thrown for effect. Instead I reached into my purse and placed a cream envelope by his plate. He blinked, the triumph in his face wobbling like a neon sign. "What's this?" he asked, as if I'd left him a riddle. "Something for later," I said. I kissed Lily on the temple, felt the salty weight of her graduation day on my tongue, and told the room, with as much ordinary politeness as I could muster, to enjoy the rest of their meal. Then I walked outside, the August air hit me like truth, hot and immediate. I could breathe. For the first time in a long time, the air belonged to me. What they didn't know was that the envelope was the start of a long, slow unspooling. I had not arrived there by impulse or spite. I had spent months learning how a man who talks like a poet moves numbers like a thief. I'd been a finance director my whole life. Money leaves traces the way footprints do in wet clay. Small transfers to a shadow account. Lease applications with other names on them. Jewelry receipts folded into takeout menus. And late at night, a phone left unlocked. When you handle a family's money for 20 years you learn patience. You learn to wait until you have the map drawn, the evidence documented, the lawyers lined up like sentries. I learned to record his words, not because I revel in hearing him say them, but because proof is a language cruel men understand. Marcus believed he was clever. He scheduled his public betrayal for a day when my daughter should have only been thinking about mortarboards. He thought the spectacle would let him cut both of us out with applause. He thought Nora, his much younger confidante, would stand steady beside him. He was wrong on both counts that I did not burst into that restaurant to humiliate him. I did it to keep Lily from becoming collateral. You plan a life with someone, you don't sign up to be erased because they learned how to lie convincingly. When I left, I drove past the avenue maples that shade our neighborhood and went straight home, the house Marcus had promised to someone else in offhand texts. It looked normal from the street, but normal is a costume. Inside, I opened a closet that still smelled faintly of my father's aftershave and found suitcases tucked away, shirts folded as if a funeral for our marriage had already been scheduled. Predictable habits reveal character. The man who labels his boxes is the man who believes consequences are for other people. That I sat at our kitchen table, turned on my laptop, and watched his plan fold under my proof. The recordings, his voice outlining their beachfront fantasies, Nora's breathy reassurances, played like instruments in an orchestra tuned to my advantage. When I called Miles Grant, my attorney, the words were clinical: emergency filing, preliminary injunction, freeze on identified accounts. Within hours certain lines of credit closed like doors behind him. He arrived home furious, clutching my envelope like a challenge. "You served me today," he spat, voice flaking into panic when he realized what I'd done. His panic was the only honest thing left in his expression. I told him this: "You wanted a new life. I simply expedited your departure. You asked me when you secretly put our family on layaway for your fantasies, when you chose something else over our vows, and I have an answer." Marcus sneered that the prenup had expired. He didn't bother to read Section 11 closely, the fidelity clause that had been included when we married, a clause he himself insisted on signing because he'd once feared he had nothing to lose. Irony tastes like coin. That clause had teeth. It did what contracts are supposed to do: it turned his impulsive adultery into legal leverage for the person he'd underestimated, me. You could call it revenge. You could call it justice. I prefer the term reclamation. For too long I had annotated my life in margins while he drew center stage. I was not interested in destroying him, I was interested in funding the life I'd been promising myself in the quiet hours. I used the freeze not to punish but to redirect, to secure Lily's future, to make sure Marcus couldn't sign away our home, and, selfishly, joyfully, to see the consultancy I'd deferred for 20 years, one that helps women stop outsourcing their stability. When he tried to make me feel small, "You're being cold," I let him. The truth is colder. I recorded the conversations where he called me trusting, as if that were an illness. I printed the bank statements where the money had crept out like a slow leak. I walked through the house and catalogued the pieces of my life he'd assumed were disposable. I did not relish it. I catalogued because decisions deserve consequences. Marcus tried to braid the narrative back in his favor. He came to my sister-in-law's bungalow like a man apologizing at an audition. Nora trailed behind him looking suddenly like someone who had been volunteering for a role she hadn't fully read. Lily, God, my daughter, stood tall in the living room where the afternoon light slanted in and painted her like a liturgy. She didn't beg for compromise. She didn't need to. She simply said, with the bluntness of youth and the armor of betrayal, "You blew up my graduation." There was a sharpness in her voice I both feared and admired. She accused him of stealing, of making the family's quiet economy into his own private expense account. He had been stealing for months and calling it planning. When he looked at his daughter, the man who had once taught her to ride a bike looked suddenly like a stranger whose map was missing the roads that mattered. They left in a flurry of entitlement and complaint, but the cracks had already started. Nora, the confident interloper, was startled to discover the apartment she thought was theirs had never been approved. Marcus had not completed the lease application. Somewhere, someone had flagged his credit. That tiny bureaucratic hiccup felt deliciously proportional to the scale of his betrayal. People love clear endings. Life rarely affords them. What I did afford myself, and Lily, was a clean start. I didn't stand in the rubble to watch him burn. I put a roof over our heads, froze accounts that threatened our security, and opened a door I'd been too scared to approach when I was busy keeping everything from collapsing. The twist. The most surprising thing was not the legal maneuvering or the recordings. It was how little I needed the vindication to feel whole. The moments that took my breath were quieter. Lily asleep in a chair with the tassel from her cap tangled in her hair, Rosa, Marcus's sister, holding my hand and saying, "We should have told you sooner, Miles," my lawyer, sliding a single line of text across a screen that said, "Emergency filing approved." At night, when I lie awake and replay the sound of plates clinking in that restaurant, what lingers is not triumph. It is the memory of breathing for the first time in years. Freedom, I have learned, is not always loud. Sometimes it is the soft act of setting a place at the table for yourself and refusing to be reduced to a footnote. That if you're watching this and you've ever raged quietly in a kitchen, or signed papers in the dark, or swallowed a truth to preserve someone else's illusion, tell me about it. Comment. Share. Tell me the moment you learned you could breathe again. Because the story isn't mine alone, it belongs to every woman who learns the language of her own accounts and spends them on a life that finally fits. That I walked away that day from more than a man. I walked toward myself. And yes, the cost was high. But the price of pretending I hadn't seen it would have been higher still. So tell me, what would you have done in my shoes?